To grow. Verb. To spring up, to increase, to expand, to develop, to have an increasing influence, to cultivate, to raise, to produce, to breed, gather, glean, to harvest, ripen, bloom, and to advance. To promote the development of. I think we all know what it means to grow. We grow up, we grow old, we grow wiser, but past all that, there's something else, something deeper. Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Stay with me and you'll bear fruit. Or put another way, stay with me and you'll grow. But what does that mean for us? In 2020, in West Michigan, in our homes, in our communities. What does that mean for us, knowing that the message of the gospel seems irrelevant to the younger generations? What are we going to do to help connect with teens and young adults? Are we willing to abandon our comforts and preferences to reach people who need the gospel? Are we willing to allow this younger generation to shape our church culture and help us reach others? Are we going to sit on the sidelines and wait for someone else to do the work for us? Or are we willing to work hard and be growing young?
Hey, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for being a part of this Growing Young series with us. I don't know if you are a person who counts, who tracks things, but I was kind of surprised to realize that this is message number 10 in the Growing Young series. And I'm going to be super duper honest with you today and say that I know that I've heard around the edges just teeny little whispers of growing young fatigue. And I get that in the sense that we're talking about something that is sort of pushing us maybe in a direction that we don't completely feel comfortable going. It's intended to not make you uncomfortable, but to get us all to sort of re-examine our priorities when we are engaged in the life of the church. And so I want to go back to start with today, talking about prioritizing young people and their parents everywhere, and remind you of one of the things that I said in one of the very first messages. I challenged you to rethink your view of the disciples of Jesus, saying that oftentimes because we know that a movie is a movie and a TV series is a TV series, and yet what they portray does sort of impact our perspective. And in all of the movies about Jesus and his disciples, and all of the TV series about them, we see the disciples as a mostly older group of people, with people like Peter, for example, being kind of a middle-aged, pot-bellied man with a receding hairline and a gray beard. That's Peter. And the reality, if you look at the way a teacher, a rabbi, gathered disciples to himself, which Jesus is the rabbi and the disciples are his followers, his pupils, usually a rabbi would start at the age of 30 and he would call to himself people that were younger than him. And so Bible scholars believe that the disciples of Jesus were probably somewhere between 13 and 30 years of age. It's not impossible that a person could be an older follower of a rabbi, but that would have been somewhat unusual. So with that in mind, think about this and how we do church. We look at people that are 13 to say 29 or 15 to 29, as the book says, and we say, here's the problem with giving them keys. Here's the problem with giving them real responsibility and real ministry and real opportunities and real chances to lead in the life of our church. They're young enough that they're likely to get it wrong. They're likely to mess up. They're likely to make a mistake. Therefore, let's just keep them in the bullpen for a little while longer until we can see that they're not likely to make any mistakes. Failing at that point in time to realize that we, at age 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, still do what? Make mistakes. We still mess up. We're still imperfect. And so we need to look at Jesus and his disciples and realize that he not only called these men to follow him, but he gave them real, live life experience. He gave them opportunities. He challenged them. He pushed them. He sent them out. He let them try things that they probably never would have guessed that they would have tried to do in their lives. So we look at Jesus today in a very intentional way. This Jesus who at age 30 himself began this amazing 3-year ministry. And one of the things that we notice in Jesus' ministry right out of the gate is because of his personality, because of his teaching, and of course, because of the miracles, he grows a following that is getting larger and larger all the time. It goes from hundreds of people gathering to listen to what Jesus had to say and asking if he could do miracles for them, to finally we get to the feeding miracles, and it's what? Thousands of people. The one gospel, the good news story about Jesus, it says that there were 5,000 men plus women and children. So probably 10,000 people present at this point in time. And here are 12 young men who are following Jesus, who realize that they are his pupils, his entourage, and yet they're going, what's our place in this? What should we be doing? And if you read the Gospels with this in mind, you will see it. You'll see that they began to take upon themselves the role and responsibility of people who needed to decide who got access to Jesus and who didn't. Now, I don't think that that's a role that Jesus ever gave the disciples. Doesn't make it a bad, evil, sinful thing, but I never see Jesus telling his disciples, hey, you guys got to help me out. You've got to protect me from these people. You've got to keep the crowd from me. But they took that role upon themselves. And they, I'm sure, had all good intentions. Listen, we need to protect Jesus. There are so many people. And by the way, Jesus has his enemies. He has people like the Pharisees who don't like him at all. And so we kind of need to watch the crowds. We need to keep him away. We need to protect Jesus. We need to be his gatekeepers, right? We need to be his gatekeepers because someone has to keep this nonstop request for help me, help me, help me, feed me, feed me. Somebody has to protect him. And ultimately, here's what you find. You find the disciples in a place where they are trying to decide who does and does not, who would and would not have access to Jesus. At the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 men plus women and children, before you get to Jesus and the miracle and the little boy bringing his lunchbox and that turning into enough food for 10,000 plus, you have the disciples saying, listen, Jesus, send these people away. Don't give them access to you anymore. But they also not only decide who's worthy and unworthy, but you'll see them letting people like the rich young ruler through without any hindrance at all. They see this young guy that they know is an up-and-coming leader in the community of Israel, and they go, oh, absolutely, go to Jesus right away. And they are shocked and they are disappointed when Jesus challenges that young man as to, will you really follow me? What if it costs you your wealth? And the young man says, well, if following Jesus is going to cost me my wealth and my power, then no thank you. And the disciples are like, Jesus, don't let him get away. So they are deeming who is worthy and who is unworthy. And this leads to a moment, a very important moment for our purposes today, where Jesus clarifies for them again, and he has to do this over and over again. And let me go back to what I started by saying, that our concern that younger people serving and ministering are going to get it wrong. Did Jesus not know that? You find Jesus again and again and again and again and again teaching these 12 men the same exact lesson because they don't get it. But today we're going to look at one instance where he clarifies, no, you guys are misunderstanding what my kingdom priorities are. This is what my kingdom looks like, and this is what my priorities look like. There were young parents who wanted the same thing that young parents want today. Yeah, I know. We think about our kids and we think about parents, we go, what I'd really like them is to be more self-sufficient. What I'd really like them to do is clean their room. What I'd really like them to do is do their homework. What I'd really like them to do is be quiet for a little while, stop being so demanding. I know what parents want. But if you take a parent and you push them in the corner and say, listen, you get to have one request for your kids. What one thing do you want for your kids? you would say, I want my kids or my grandkids or whatever, I want this child that I love to be known by God and blessed, right? In Jesus' day, it was the exact same thing. So Mark 10. One day, some parents brought their children to Jesus so that he could touch and bless them. But the disciples, the gatekeepers, the deciders, they thought of who's worthy and unworthy to get to spend time with Jesus. But the disciples scolded the parents for bothering him. You can't bother Jesus with these children. You can't ask him to stop what he's doing and to do this for you. Verse 14, I love this. When Jesus saw what was happening, he was angry. He was angry with his disciples. He said to them, let the children come to me, don't stop them. For the kingdom of God belongs to those who are like these children. I tell you the truth, anyone who doesn't receive the kingdom of God like a child will never enter it. Then he took the children in his arms and he placed his hands on their heads and he blessed them. And I love that picture of Jesus. Now, most of you are familiar with that story, right? At least a little. You've heard that. Let the little children come to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. So it does not surprise you. It does not shock you that Jesus got upset with the disciples, that Jesus welcomed those parents to bring their children to him, and he welcomed those children one by one to come into his presence, to be prayed for, to be blessed, to literally be held by the Son of God. That doesn't surprise you. That's because your reaction is based on our culture. Most of us believe that the disciples are wrong in scolding the parents and telling them to take their kids away because our culture generally values children. Not all the time, but generally. There are entire agencies, there are entire organizations that are focused on the promotion of the welfare of children, taking care of children, and beyond that, to providing support and services and so on for parents that are struggling in raising their children. And wonderful. I love that. But that's our culture. Jesus is in the first century. Jesus is talking to people who, I'm guessing that those parents, when the disciples said, take your kids away from Jesus, he doesn't have time for this, the parents go, I'm not surprised by that. And started to walk away. Why? Because things were so different in the first century. In our day, in the 21st century, if you hear an adult say the old school phrase, children are to be seen but not heard, right? Most of us kind of bristle at that a little bit. I heard that a lot when I was a kid growing up. My parents and their peers, they would say to kids, hey, kids are to be seen and not heard. That wasn't an attempt to say kids are worthless. It was just a way of saying kids know your place. And while us parents are talking about important stuff, like how new is your car and so forth, that you kids should just stand there and be quiet. But nowadays, to be honest, we don't really talk like this. But that phrase, children are to be seen and not heard, pales in comparison to the way things were in the Roman culture of the first century. And you need to remember that Jesus is talking to people impacted by the Roman culture in the first century. Don't miss that. What was the Roman culture of the first century like when it came to children? Well, here's some shocking things, actually. That it was very patriarchal. I mean, the dad, the man, his word was absolute law. His opinion, his prejudices were absolute law in a family. And so a father could look at a child that had disappointed them or rubbed them the wrong way or whatever and just say, I disown you. And that child was gone, was out of the family just like that. A father could disown, could sell into slavery, or even have his own children killed if he wanted to. He had that much blanket authority. In fact, not going into a lot of detail because this could get kind of a little bit morbid. But here's one of the practices in the Roman culture. When a midwife would deliver a child, they would take that child and they would place it on the floor or on a stool or something, on a bench. And then they would call the father into the room. And this is how absolutely subjective and impulse driven it was. They would call the father into the room and he would look at that baby. And based on how that baby looked to him that very first time seeing it, would go, I like him or I don't like him. I accept them or I reject them. I want them or I don't want them. And if he didn't want it, it was like, sell it to someone, make it a slave. It would be, let it die, whatever it was. So it was a very different culture. And that was even worse if you were a girl. Sons, they had some potential. The dad still had to kind of like the way they looked and so forth. But daughters had no rights and very little value in that culture. And sons, generally speaking, didn't have any value to their father until age 12. And at age 12, they would bring the child in. It had been raised by someone else, not by their father. They would bring the child in at age 12, and he would look at that boy, and at that point he would say, I accept you or I reject you. I keep you or I sell you. That's the mindset. Now, the Jewish culture was somewhat different. Oftentimes they were the slave that was raising a Roman child. But that slave, whether they be Jew or some other Gentile group of people, actually had more value in the Roman culture and to that family than their own children did. A slave had more value than a child. Now, the Jewish culture, I do not want you to walk away thinking that I'm saying that the Jewish people in the Roman culture, under that dominance, saw things exactly the same way, because that wasn't true. But you know how it is when you are a subculture within a more dominant culture? When you're, even in our country, if you are a state and you're a state that's, let's say, is a little bit more conservative, but you see on a national level things getting a little bit more progressive or whatever the case is, you can not necessarily buy into the big picture of the culture, but feel the pressure to conform. And I think that's what the Jewish people would have felt. Like, hey, our attitude towards our kids is not like the Roman people at all. And yet you're somewhat influenced by that mindset. But here's what you need to understand about the Jewish, though different mindset. Still, in the first century, only about 25% of all children survived. So we have a 75% mortality rate, and that had to make parents at least a little bit hesitant to fully invest themselves in every child, knowing that they were going to go through all of the serious and not so serious childhood diseases and illnesses, right? They're going to get all the bacterials, all the infections, all of the different, mumps or measles or whatever the case would be. And so that child might not survive, so why invest too much in them emotionally? All of that to say this. Jesus is putting a high value on children in a culture that generally didn't. He is spending time with them. He is blessing them. He is encouraging and honoring their parents. What you see Jesus doing throughout his 3 years of training and reshaping his disciples and their mindset is confronting their misunderstandings about what's really important. And one of the things that he wants them to understand is, in our culture, this might not be the way everybody else does it, but in my kingdom, children and young people are very, very important. And I'm kind of, in a sense, glad that it took the disciples so many times to get this, for this reason and this reason only. Because it gives me hope. Because I continue to be kind of dense on some of this stuff that relates to the priorities of the kingdom of Jesus. Now remember this about Jesus and his kingdom as we move forward. Jesus made it very clear that in his kingdom, the greatest honor was to serve. Don't run past that. Jesus made it clear again and again and again that in his kingdom, the greatest honor, the most important and valuable thing you can do is to serve. Now, I know that in our culture, and again, in this political season where, we're talking about who's going to be the president for the next 4 years, and we talk about leadership qualities. We look for different things in leaders than Scripture does. Jesus said, in my kingdom, my value and my priority is on being a servant. In fact, can he say it more clearly than this? Mark chapter 9. After they arrived at Capernaum and settled in a house, Jesus asked his disciples, who, by the way, parenthetically, had been steps behind him on the road walking to this village. They had been arguing with each other about greatness in Jesus' kingdom. They assumed that any time now, Jesus was going to say or do the right thing, and his kingdom rule and reign on planet Earth was going to start. That's what they thought. So they're back there arguing among themselves about which of them is the greatest. He says, what were you discussing on the road? But they didn't answer because they had been arguing about which of them was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12 disciples over to him and said, whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else. Wow. They think Jesus is coming to restore Israel to world dominance right then and there. And so they are jockeying for cabinet positions. And they have it completely backwards. You see, the disciples get it wrong. They are equating being the boss and ruling with success. They think the greater my position, the higher my position, that means the more people that will be under me, under my authority, the more people that are serving me, the more important I am. And Jesus flips that on its head. And he says, no, sorry guys, wrong kingdom. That is the exact wrong understanding. The more advanced your position, the greater you are, the more people you are serving. Now, I know, even in a context like this, that is easy to hear and we go, yep, that's the way it is, yep, upside down kingdom, Jesus' priority is different than our priorities, and to hear that and not really let it sink in. But let's let that sink in. The more people that you are serving, the more people you are honoring, the more your authority in the kingdom of Jesus. And one more thing, you can't miss this in the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The priority is serving those that are powerless. The priority is on serving those that are weak, those who are looked down on, those who are ignored and who are marginalized by the average person in society. The passage continues. Now remember, he said, the greatest in my kingdom is the servant of everyone else, and then he does it again. On the heels of that, he brings a child in for an object lesson. And I love the number of times that Jesus puts little children in front of his disciples and says, look at it. Look at this. This is important. This means something. This is vital. And for all of those cultural reasons that I stated, how children were devalued and ignored in the Roman culture around them and somewhat kept at an emotional distance until they were older from the adults because of mortality. He says, this is important. He put a little child among them, and taking the child in his arms, he said to them, anyone who welcomes a little child like this, and don't run past the word welcomes, because it doesn't mean, hi kid, hi little kid. We'll talk about welcome in a second. Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also my Father who sent me. So look, he goes up the chain of command. At this point in time, God being one, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, equal members of the Godhead. But during this time, Jesus is here on planet Earth. He is dependent on the leading of the Holy Spirit and to doing the Father's will according to that leading. So he has taken a servant role. He says, understand the chain of command. If you are welcoming me, you're welcoming the Father in all of his fullness and power. But to welcome a child is to welcome me and to welcome the Father. This is profound. If you came in today knowing that this was going to be said, you should have duct taped your head together. That would have been appropriate, because this is a mind-blowing truth. We say welcoming and we think you're welcome here. When Jesus says welcoming, he means that you have to fully accept someone. To welcome a child was to recognize the full value of that child and completely accept them. And so Jesus is saying, when you completely accept and bring this child into full relational acceptance with you, you're doing the same thing to me, and you're doing the same thing to my Father. To recognize the value of a child was to recognize the value of Jesus. Now let's flip this for a second, because if you look at it in the opposite direction, what Jesus is saying is, you can't say that you value me if you don't value children and young people. Feel free to argue with me if you want to later about this, but if you take what Jesus says and you take it to heart, he's really saying you can't say that you value me if you don't value these that I care about. In Matthew, he takes it a step further. He warns against doing anything that causes a child to become spiritually frustrated, spiritually confused, or to lose faith. Here's how he says it. Jesus called a little child to him and put the child among them. Here we go again, but I love it because he does it again and again and again in all four Gospels. Then he said, I tell you the truth, unless you turn from your sin and become like little children, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven. So anyone who becomes as humble as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf is welcoming me. But if you cause one of these little ones who trust in me to fall into sin, it would be better for you to have a large millstone tied around your neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. So here's Jesus, and you're reading his life, and you notice that he gets mad or very pointed about certain things. Now, there are things that say in Jesus, when he said this or when he saw this, he was filled with great joy. But today I just want you to go to a few things that when Jesus saw them made him mad. And Jesus did get mad. I know that there's the kumbaya Jesus that always just kind of like floated 3 inches off the ground, and he never got mad at anybody. All he did is pronounce blessings. That's not true. That's not really Jesus. Jesus got happy, but Jesus also got upset. And notice the things that Jesus got mad at. Twice in his ministry, he got mad when he went into the temple courts and he saw people that were setting up money changers and selling money or exchanging currencies and selling animals at an outrageous price, because those people were keeping the Gentiles from approaching the God of Israel, and that made him mad. Then he goes to the graveside of his friend Lazarus that he knows he's going to raise back to life. And it says that Jesus was filled with emotion, literally filled with anger. Why? He's about to raise his friend from the dead. What's he upset about? He's upset about the fall. He's upset about the sin and the brokenness of humanity that made things like death and grief a part of our everyday experience. And so he's mad at people who keep Gentiles away from God, the Jewish God. He's mad at death because it wasn't supposed to be that way. And he's mad at people who keep children away from him and from his kingdom. He's upset that his disciples want to be served rather than serve. He's upset that they try to keep the weak and the powerless away from him. And so, as I've already said, Jesus kept teaching these guys the same lesson over and over and over again, and he modeled for them what it meant to be a servant to those who didn't deserve it in his ministry from start to finish. He modeled servant leadership. In fact, this is probably my favorite Jesus servant leadership story from John chapter 13. Jesus knew, this is at the supper before he goes to be betrayed and crucified. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, that he had come from God and would return to God. So here he is. He knows that he is God come to planet Earth. He knows that he's returning to his full authority in heaven. And so he gets up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, poured water in a basin, and then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel around him. This is the rabbi washing the feet of the pupil. This is the Lord washing the feet of those that should have been his servants. But they don't get it, and he does. And this is probably the most poignant lesson he ever tries to teach these guys, is you should have been doing this for me and each other. Instead of arguing about greatness and arguing about authority and arguing about power, let it go. After washing their feet, he put on his robe again and sat down and asked, "Do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, because that's what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you." I tell you the truth, slaves are not greater than their master, nor is the messenger more important than the one who sends the message. Now that you know these things, God will bless you if you do them. Let me pause right there and say something kind of bluntly. To whatever degree you have some amount of growing young fatigue, okay, I can accept that. Seriously, I can accept that. I can accept it graciously. I've been in this book for week after week, literally for month after month, going through this stuff and trying to get a grasp on it for myself. I get that it's different. I get that at times it's even hard and not the way I want church to be. But do me a favor. Think about what Jesus says at the very end of this passage, as he has one last opportunity to say to his disciples, if you don't get anything else, get this. You have to do the things that I have been modeling for you. You have to actually do what I've been teaching you to do. That's the only way you're going to be blessed. God will bless you if you not only know these things, but if you do them. And so you can, with my permission, sort of have a moderately bad attitude about growing young, as long as you take this to heart. Okay? I'm just going to do some of the things that I've been asked to do. I'm going to pay more attention to the children. I'm going to pay more attention to the youth. I'm going to pray for them more fervently. I'm going to pray for them more frequently. I'm going to look for opportunities to have conversation with them. I'm going to look for ways to encourage them. I'm going to look for ways to encourage their parents. I'm not going to let young parents like Zach and Kayla walk in here and walk out of the building without knowing that they are noticed, that they are wanted, that they are loved, that I care about what's going on with them and their marriage and their family. You do that, I'm a happy camper. I'm a happy camper. Jesus said, when you do the things that I've asked you to do, God will bless you. Here, I put this, I love that tucked in all the prophecies that people read about the Messiah, the one who would come to redeem the world. The one thing that was there that sort of was like, really? That's a weird sort of thing, was this prophecy about what the heart of Jesus would look like. Look at this from Isaiah chapter 40. He says, see, the sovereign Lord comes with power. Power. And he rules with a mighty arm. Mighty. See, his reward is with him, and his recompense, judgment, accompanies him. All that stuff makes God sense, right? Next verse. He gathers the lambs into his arms. Here is this mighty warrior, this one with all of this strength and with all of this authority. And what does he do? He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have young, their parents. That's why we're talking about prioritizing young people and their parents everywhere in the life of the church. See, here's what I'm most disturbed by when I look in the mirror. That I'm like the disciples and the disciples are like us. Sometimes they acted like they were the center of the universe. Like they were the most important, and so how everyone else got treated, how everyone else interacted with Jesus, that was secondary to them and where they stood. And that's just not the way Jesus was. From the book Growing Young, let me read this portion of a paragraph. The book says, "How much would you and your church give up to reach young people? Prioritization of young people represents our tangible, institutional commitment to allocate resources and attention across the life of the congregation, not just in the ministries we've dedicated to them." In other words, it's a good thing and it's a right thing that we have a children's ministry and a children's ministry director. That Mary has her staff and they are working hard every week to invest in our children. That's a good thing and it's a right thing. And we have things allocated to them. Same with youth ministry. Pastor Justin, the great volunteers that he has working with them and the spaces that we have given to them. But it just keeps saying, but understand, that's not enough. If these young people come into church and they see that the youth pastor cares about them, but that the senior pastor doesn't, that the youth pastor and the staff care about them, but the rest of the people in the church, all of you all, don't care about them, it won't have the impact that it should. And that's where in that growing young circle, there's a line that goes out and says, you can do all the other things, but if you don't prioritize the young people and their families, you will not be as effective at this as you could be. You can have keychain leadership. You can empathize with them. You can have warm community surrounding them, Jesus-centered, gospel-centered messages. But if you fail to do this, it won't work, at least not as effectively as it could. So here's how we're going to wrap up today, by asking what our priorities as individuals within this church are. What are our priorities? Jesus said that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. In other words, if you want to know what you prioritize, look at what you're captivated by. Look at what you're pursuing or following or devoting yourself to. When it comes to asking someone if they're devoted to God or not, oftentimes we've said things like this. You can know if somebody's really got the right priorities in pursuing God by looking at their calendar and their bank statement, right? Used to say calendar and checkbook, but then now 90% of people don't even know what a checkbook is. But by looking at a person's calendar and how they spend their money, you can tell what someone's priorities are. And so for a church, yes, we want to reach all people. This good news about Jesus is for all people, every generation, 90 down to 9 months. But we have to prioritize somewhere. And we're choosing to concentrate on those that are at what I'm going to call a freedom crossroad in their life. A freedom crossroad. In other words, at age 15, they're on the verge of getting their driver's license. At the age of 15, a lot of parents don't want to fight with their kids anymore about coming to church. 16 years old, they have their driver's license. They've got all kinds of activities that the school is excitedly joining them to participate in. They've got all the things in society and culture that are saying, come and be a part of this. This is meaningful. This is important. This is exciting. And the church is going, hey, we got a youth pastor. I'm actually more excited about Justin than that. But you know what I'm saying? Justin can't do it by himself. Mary can't do it by herself. Their staffs can't do it by themselves. It is a matter of, are we all going to prioritize this so that when we're here and beyond, but right now we're talking about when we're here, are we going to do things differently? So here's what I want you to just think through. Here are our priorities, and it's provable. Just look at how we do these things, and you'll know what your personal priorities are. First, what dominates our conversations? What do we talk about? Who do we talk to? I sort of made Zach and Kayla Keck feel a little uncomfortable because I mentioned them by name. But names are important. And when you come in and you say, I've got my friends Bill, Jim, and John, but I think I'm going to make sure that I talk to Zach. That's a powerful thing. Who you talk to and what you talk about is incredibly important. And as Pastor Michael said last week, if you got in the habit of walking up to a younger person or a younger parent and said to them, hey, how are things going in your home? How's your kid doing? How are your kids, plural, doing? Any way I can encourage you? What can I pray for you about? Wow, that would just speak volumes to them. What do we talk about? Next, what gets the priority in our finances? We have budgets for different ministries, children's ministry, youth ministry. Let me pat you on the back and give you a round of applause for Pastor Justin just last week wrapped up this thing where people were asked to give over and above gifts to youth ministry so that kids could go to summer camps and programs and events this summer. Kids who have, in many cases, parents in their lives that either are unable or don't care to spend anything extra to have them engaged in what youth ministry does. And something like $3,000 so far on Monday had been given. Good for you. That's $3,000 above our normal regular offerings. That's incredible. But we always have to be looking at the allocation of our finances as an evidence of our priorities. Next, the priority when it comes to space. We are at a phase right now where we are on the verge of talking about what do we do next with our building. Because we definitely have some pinch points, some places where there's not room for the ministry and what our ministry is even currently generating, much less what it's capable of. As we talk about those things, are the children and the youth going to get priority attention when it comes to that? I know they should make it nice for me. I get that. I mean, really, it should be about 6 square foot right here that get all the priority when it comes to the church. Messing with you. One last one. What gets your priority? What gets your priority time? The people that are currently engaged in children's ministry and youth ministry, I'll be honest with you, they actually need more help. They need more help. Now, I'm going to let them vet and pick and choose their help the way that they want to, but just to say that if in this series at some point in time God spoke to your heart and he goes, you know what, you could be doing more, you could give a little bit more time. There are avenues of service. A friend of mine said this, and I liked it so much that I wrote it down, and I want to share this with you today. Kind of a bold statement, but I think it sort of encapsulates what I'm trying to say. You are never more Christ-like than when you put others first. You are never more Christ-like than when you serve. You put others first. You are never more anti-Christ than when you put yourself first. I hope that your life is about Jesus' upside-down kingdom and his priorities. That the way to the top is to be the servant of everyone else. That to give is the best way to receive. That to share is the best way to find yourself with abundance. All of these different kingdom concepts that all come together when Jesus picks up a small child, puts it in front of his disciples and says, this kid matters. I'm going to pray. We're going to close with a song, and then Pastor Michael is going to have a closing challenge for you. Let's pray. Father.